So our next speaker is Laurel Glidden. She currently works out of Cedar City, Utah, where she's a fuels archaeologist with the Bureau of Land Management. She's worked as an archaeologist in the Great Basin and the Southwest for the past 20 years. And today she'll be discussing some of the work she has done to manage cultural resource sites. So let's give Laurel a warm welcome.
All right, are we on? Okay. Good morning. Okay, so yes, I'm an archaeologist with the Bureau of Land Management Color Country District, and I'm located in Cedar City. And over the next day or two, we're going to talk a lot about multiple uses and conflicts that can arise between competing interests. And what I'd like to offer you today is the perspective of another internal conflict that arises between the policies and regulations that govern archaeology and our objectives. And to start with, I thought I would just explain a little bit about what I do as a fuels archaeologist and what we do with the Fire and Fuels program in Color Country District. And I kind of peppered this presentation with some archaeological eye candy, and I'll kind of explain it as we go along. But for starters, my position is unique in that most agency archaeologists are responsible for compliance for a variety of different types of projects. My job and 3 other archaeologists in the state of Utah, we only support the fire and fuels programs, which basically means we're responsible for compliance for any kind of vegetation treatment or fire rehabilitation effort. And as I said, this photograph over here, I thought this was so great. It's a buggy frame from a horse and buggy. It was found in Hamlin Valley, which is, I think this was in Iron County. And then the one on the right is of a Navajo Hogan that was found in Kane County. So a little bit about what we do in the Color Country Fuels program. We do landscape restoration. And this can come in the form of a bunch of different kinds of projects just based on what the objectives of those projects are. So we do fuels reduction. You know, if the objective is to reduce the amount of fuels and reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires. We do habitat improvement, sometimes for specific species. In the end, I think these things are all kind of related, but basically the ultimate goal is to create a diverse and resilient landscape that improves wildlife habitat, range conditions, as well as the watershed quality. And where I come in, as I said earlier, I'm responsible for the compliance. Every federal agency and state agency in the state of Utah, by the way, is responsible for taking into consideration the effects of their undertaking on archaeological resources or cultural resources. And the way we go about that, to begin with, is an investigation of some type. And the level of investigation that we do is commensurate with the type of project. So a project that has not as many impacts, we do, less of an investigation, I guess, versus one where the impacts are greater, and we'll do a more thorough, intensive investigation. In archaeology in the Southwest, there's basically 3 levels of investigations that can take place. The first one is what we call a Class 1 or a literature review, which is kind of what it sounds like, where basically we just take a look at the existing literature, what kind of research has been done in that area previously, and it gives us an idea of what kind of resources to expect. And that, like I said, that kind of review we would do for something like a hand-thin project where we might go in with chainsaws and cut out trees. And so, again, little impacts. The second one is a Class 2 or a reconnaissance inventory. And to be quite honest, we don't do this very often, but it could be some kind of an inventory like a sample survey or a modeling exercise. But we just don't do them because it's kind of all or nothing, really. Which leads me to the last level of inventory, which is a Class 3 intensive pedestrian inventory. And that is where we walk 15-meter transects on the ground back and forth, looking for any archaeological resources that might be impacted by that particular project. And that kind of investigation, we do that when there's going to be more impact, something like a bull hog project. And when I say bull hog, I mean like mastication, a harrow project or a chaining. And as you can imagine, a Class 3 inventory is fairly time-intensive. It requires, walking literally thousands of acres, worth of transects. And so I don't typically do that. 99% of the time, we hire contractors to do that work. And just to give you an idea of the scale that we're working on in southern Utah, just in 2018 alone, we have done almost 28,000 acres of Class 3 inventory, so pedestrian inventory on the ground. And I have accomplished about 26,000 acres of literature review for a total of approximately 54,000 acres cleared. And I say cleared, I hate the word cleared. I don't like archaeological clearances because we're required by law to do more than just find the stuff. We have to take into account the opinions and insight of other organizations. So we consult with Native American tribes. We consult with organizations that might be interested in the resource of the area. And then we're also required by law to consult with the State Historic Preservation Officer. And something I just want to point out that I thought was really interesting is this year BLM announced that it had accomplished over 1 million acres worth of treatments since the inception of the National Fire Plan. And every one of those acres would have had some kind of archaeological consideration given into it. And in many cases, it would have been a Class 3 inventory. So that's kind of what I do in a nutshell and what we try to do with our fuels program. So I thought we'd talk specifically about archaeology. So archaeology is cool, right? Everybody loves archaeology. I talk to so many people that say, oh, I took Archaeology 101 in college and I loved it. And I think, why didn't you become an archaeologist? It's fun. So archaeology is great. Artifacts are great. Again, just some eye candy. This one on the far left, this is a knife, and it's huge. It's like literally the size of my palm. The second photo is just a collection of pottery sherds, These are some glass beads that were found in Kane County, probably Navajo beads. It blows my mind that they found those. I mean, they're teeny tiny. And then this last one, it looks like a mud clod. It's actually, we call it daub, D-A-U-B, and I think that's just really cool. It's essentially prehistoric plaster. So Native American folks would use that material to, in the construction of their homes. And it's really fun because sometimes you find it with fingerprints in it. So I love that stuff. And then this photograph up here is just of, it's a rubble mound, which could, it's probably either some kind of storage structure or a habitation. So agencies are required to consider the the effects of their undertakings on archaeology. In addition to that, the BLM is tasked with managing archaeology as a resource. And archaeology is unique. It's unique more so than other resources, I would say, because it's so sensitive, right? The artifacts are great. We love the artifacts. But to be quite honest, it's not the artifacts that are cool. It's what the artifacts can tell us. It can tell us about the behavior of past people. And a lot of that information comes about from where these artifacts are found, their spatial relationship to each other, and where they are both, in a local context and then a larger context or regional context. So herein lies the conflict, right? Archaeology is really sensitive. We have to be really careful with it. Once that information is gone, it's gone forever. And then, along with that, we have these really short time frames to do things. Sometimes Congress is a little pokey in getting their budgets out, so it makes it difficult for us to plan our projects. We work cooperatively with a lot of state agencies, and they don't get their budgets until the middle of the summer, basically. And again, that makes it hard for us to plan our projects. And of course, there's always fire. I have ESR, which stands for Emergency Stabilization and Rehabilitation. And of course, fires burn in the summer. And in order to ensure a successful rehabilitation, we need to treat that fire scar in the fall. So we'll go in and treat it mechanically and seed it so that we'll ensure a successful germination in the spring and hopefully, better rehabilitate the area. So, we have to do these investigations by law and by our policies, and yet we have to do it in a really short time frame. And I think these two factors have led to kind of this traditional approach, or just like an overall idea that, we can't touch archaeology. Archaeology is an obstacle that we just need to overcome just so we can move on with our project. Really often, I think there's this attitude that archaeology is a checkbox. It's something that we just have to deal with so we can move forward. And I would argue that that is not necessarily the best approach and not in the best interest of archaeological resources. So this is what we're left with. When we conduct a vegetation treatment and avoid the sites, they disappear. No? Okay. Well, we'll see. Okay, so vegetation treatment, they obviously went around the sites, and you're left with these discrete little islands of vegetation in a sea of sagebrush. For starters, I would say this does not look natural. This is not visually appealing. Another secondary effect of doing so is that animals tend to congregate in those areas. So, when we're doing, and a lot of these projects are to benefit, mule deer and other animals like that, but when we remove the vegetation, the trees left on the sites are the only trees left, and often they're the only thermal cover available. So, like in this photo, this is a deer bedded down in one of our sites, and then this is a cow and her calf. They're hanging out in a site. So it's kind of counterintuitive because we think that by avoiding the site, we're better protecting the site, when in fact we're kind of inviting impacts because, animals will congregate there and consolidate the impacts. Similarly, people like to hang out in the trees, right? People like to camp in the trees. So this is an example of a campsite in one of our ARC sites. And, just kind of as a secondary effect of people camping in an area, they get curious and look around and they might find artifacts. We see this fairly often. We call this a looter's pile, which is kind of just what it sounds like. Basically, folks walking around picking up artifacts, and then they get bored and just drop them on the ground. And as I mentioned earlier, context is everything, so any information that we could have gleaned from those artifacts is now gone. This other photograph, these two here, this green box, this top one is a hearth with a metate that was partially exposed in it. The site that this was in was avoided, and then later on when the archaeologists went back to check on the site, they had seen that the metate had been excavated. And although they were kind enough to leave the metate in place, any information that could have been gleaned from the soil around that, pollen analysis or phytolith analysis or anything like that was gone. So another factor of leaving sites is it literally creates a bullseye, right? Everybody in Kane, Iron, Garfield County, they know where to look for the ARC sites. They know where to go hunting for arrowheads. And so, again, we're kind of making them stand out and making the sites more vulnerable. So how do we, one more thing. And this is actually really important. Erosion. So the state of Utah manages our archaeological data for all agencies. And I asked them to look at, do a little research, do a little digging. And what they found was that out of almost 77,000 sites recorded in the state of Utah, 58,000 of those, or 75%, list erosion as an impact. So erosion is a widespread impact affecting archaeological sites. And I would go as far to say that a site's health or its integrity is directly related to the context in which that site is found. So if a site, so this is a site in Beaver County, and you can see there's not a lot of understory, right? There's no grasses or forbs, very little shrubs. Erosion would be a real problem with this site. And chances are, if we're doing some kind of project in an area, it's because that area is unhealthy or imbalanced, and it needs some kind of, rehabilitation. So how do we get around this, or how do we mitigate this issue? I think we need to change the way we think about archaeology. We can't think about archaeology as just something we avoid. Archaeology is not just a checkbox. The BLM and all federal agencies are required to manage archaeology as a resource. So why are we not managing it like any other resource? We need to think about it as a part of the landscape and manage it as such. So how do we do that? I would argue we do that through active management. This is an example of something we do to try to actively manage our sites. This is a project in Kane County, and the red areas, those are sites. So rather than leaving little, discrete islands of vegetation, the project manager designed the project kind of around the arc sites. They took into consideration the topography and created some large wildlife corridors. Like this project in particular was, I think it's winter mule deer habitat. And so this is perfect. You're going to need some thermal cover for those deer and some large islands. And by doing this, it not only camouflages the sites, but it will diffuse the impacts. And it looks better, right? Another thing we can do is actually remove the vegetation from the sites. A lop and scatter treatment where we go in with chainsaws and cut out the limbs or cut out the trees. It leaves some large debris that'll break down over time, and in the meantime it provides habitat for small mammals and birds. The great thing about lop and scatters is we can do those in conjunction with other types of projects. So if the project is something more intensive like a chaining or a harrow, we can do that around the site and then cut the site out, and then we're camouflaging the site and hopefully stabilizing the soils a little better at the same time. So this is a site, on the left of right after it was cut out, and then this is what it looks like. This is a different site, but this is where you can see that the material has broken down. It looks pretty good. Another method, and I love this is probably one of my favorites, is mastication. Color Country owns their own bull hog, and it's one that has an articulating arm that it can actually park outside the site and reach in and mulch the trees. So that's what happened in this case. This is that same site in Beaver County where erosion was an issue. This is the exact same site 2 years later. And you can see that there's a lot more grasses, and the mulch itself, is camouflaging and stabilizing the soils. This is a similar example of another site in Beaver County. This was in 2010, and then just 3 years later, exact same site, it looks a lot better. You would be hard-pressed to find that site unless you're really looking for it, I would say. In this case, there has to be some consideration given into the type of resource, archaeological resource, as well as the context. And the soils and the vegetation and such in this case were conducive to doing the treatment in the site. And you can see, there was very little impacts from the equipment. So this is just another example of where this was a fire that occurred. I think it was in Beaver or Iron County, and we avoided the site. And you can see there, this on the periphery, there's this nice grasses, and then inside the site, there's not a lot going on there, and it sticks out pretty well, especially with the trees still in place. It's kind of catching on that maybe leaving sites is not in the best interest of the archaeological site. So there's been a couple studies that have been taking place recently. These two were done in 2016. The first one was around the Milford Flat Fire, and that occurred in 2007. When they rehabilitated the Milford Flat Fire, they used a variety of different tools to treat some of the archaeological sites. So Dr. Heidi Roberts went out there almost 10 years later and looked at the condition of those sites after 10 years. And what she found was that the sites that were treated actually fared better in the long run than the sites that were not treated. And a similar study took place by Kirk Halford. He's the Idaho BLM lead. And what he did was he was looking at the effects of a drill seed project after the soda fire. And so what he did was he took a lithic scatter, which is basically like chippings, and measured the amount of disturbance that occurred as a result of the drill seeding treatment. And they were kind of fortunate in that during the course of that study, after they did the treatment, there was a rain event. And so they were actually able to look at the difference between, the sites that were treated and then the sites that would have been impacted by this rain event. And he kind of came to the same conclusion, that the sites that were not treated were worse off. They had more instances of erosion than the sites that were treated. So, just in conclusion, although that there's conflicts that do arise between the management of archaeological resources and the objectives of our projects, I think that we can mediate those conflicts by looking at archaeology differently. We need to think outside the box, and we need to manage archaeology as just another resource, and we need to include it in the design of the project and the plannings of the projects. And I think by doing so, we will actually benefit cultural resources in the long run. So, thank you.
All right, we'll take about 5 minutes for questions.
Yes.
When you're out on the field and you see these looter piles, do you document the patterns of what's left in the piles? And does that give you any information about maybe what they've taken away?
It can. I would say when we do see looter piles, first of all, that's an indication that maybe the site's integrity has been compromised and that there might be information already missing. The looter piles can still tell us some things. Like in that photograph, there was some decorated pottery shards, and we can still get some information about maybe who had made those shards. But again, when it comes to sites, the spatial relationship of things makes a difference. And so if we find, artifacts in one concentration, that might give us an indication that there's a work area there or something like that. So, that information is lost. We can still get something from it, but it's, unfortunately, a lot of it can be lost. So, yeah. Yeah.
Forgive my ignorance about archaeology. I know nothing about what you do.
Uh-huh.
When you come upon a site, is the inventory happen and then everything's left in place, or is there like not a harvesting of it, but is there like some sort of collection and preservation that happens?
No, so that's a really good question actually, because when we do our surveys, we're just looking for what's on the landscape, and that it is left in place. And that's why it is so important, I think, that we make efforts to kind of conceal that information, because what's happening is that, we say it's an arc site, we can't touch it. If we touch it, we'll disturb that information. But by doing so, we're kind of making those stand out. So if you imagine, we might have a bullhog treatment. We find an arc site, maybe it's a habitation or something like that. If we do the project all around it and just leave the trees right there, it's just going to draw attention and impacts to that site. So, that's a good question. We do, archaeologists, we like to leave things in place. Actually, we don't like to do data recovery. We don't like to take things out of that context because we can always learn more, as technology improves and stuff. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
As far as the hands-off approach.
Mm-hmm.
What has been your experience with dealing with other archaeologists, colleagues, SHPO, that kind of thing, taking that approach?
It's funny. I would actually say more archaeologists are open to the idea. Like I said before, we do have to consult with the SHPO, and one of the things we consult with them on is our approach to treating sites or leaving them alone. And thus far, he's been really supportive of this. I just think that what is really going to help is more research. We could use some more research into the effects. You know, we've already got kind of a good start with fire rehabilitation, but I think we could use some more research as far as fuels project, you know, proactive vegetation projects, and looking at the effects of treating sites and how that affects archaeology over time. But so if there's any grad students that need a project, let me know. But yeah, I think we're starting to see people kind of realize that maybe we need to look at things differently. So, yeah.
Reflecting back on some of the earlier presentations about people in the landscape, how do you balance sharing information about sites so people can appreciate them with not wanting to disturb the sites? Is there an education component? Do you envision perhaps in the future licensing almost people or individuals or groups to share that information with them once they understand what's required to preserve the sites?
Yeah, it's a really tricky balancing act, right? Because we're a public lands management agency and it's a public resource. On the other hand, those resources are protected by law. The Archaeological Resource Protection Act prevents us from sharing any locational information, any information that would specifically give away where that site is located, because it could potentially be looted. There's some pretty strict standards for folks that want to do research or investigations into cultural resources on public lands. But, you know, on the other hand, we want people to enjoy them, right? Because it is a public resource. I think that's why we make efforts to develop public archaeological sites that are maybe more set up to receive the public and withstand impacts and be monitored and stuff. So it's kind of hard. But yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so it's kind of two parts. So first, is the work that you were showing up here primarily CRM work?
Yes.
So was it, and was that for private ownership or was it development?
So the question she's asking at CRM, that's Cultural Resource Management, and that's the contractors that carry out the work, the surveys that we do. So the surveys that they did for us, like the 27,000 acres that was surveyed, was in support of fuels treatments. And so all of that survey would have been those would have all been chaining, bull hog, harrow type projects. So they would be for vegetation projects.
So then my second question before that then is the impacts on the wildlife, moving like that, the image that you showed of moving the entire forested area and turning it into a grassland, which is good for erosion. What is the impacts then of the wildlife and the habitation of those animals?
Good question. So, and this would probably be more appropriate for a natural resource specialist, but the projects that we're doing are typically designed to improve habitat. So, for example, the mule deer habitat, that in that condition, the trees there were really old, decadent. They had mistletoe in them. It was just a really unhealthy landscape, and so there wasn't a lot of forage for the animals. And so by removing the trees, we're encouraging the grasses and forbs to grow, and so it'll benefit, and provide food for wildlife. And that's why I think it's important when we plan our projects they leave certain areas. I mean, it's not just sites they leave areas, for cover, so, animals can feel safe or, get out of the sun or get out of the cold or whatever. And so, that's definitely a consideration when they plan and do their projects. So.
All right, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you.
Thank you.